last night to join us. It was about, was it 8:45 or something like that she flew into town. So we really do appreciate Peter's time. Many of you would be familiar with Peter's work as Professor of Religious Education at Australian Catholic University. And I had the great pleasure of introducing Peter at the Bishops in Service Day in Rockhampton. And for those who listen very carefully, you'd be able to do the CV as well, wouldn't you? But one of the surprises for me in learning about people, I had no idea. She graduated from the Queensland Conservatorium of Music. Did you know that? She was a music specialist with Education Queensland. Woman of many talents, do you not know? Has taught both in primary, secondary and at tertiary levels. Many people would associate Peter with religious education, but the creative arts, I also think, are a very, very strong suit of Peter's. I was lucky enough to do one of my courses in my Masters of RE with Peter, where she was talking about the creative arts and scripture. It was a delightful course to do. So I'm very grateful for Peter, for both the person that she is. They tell me that she started studying theology in 1983. We're not going to try and do the maths on that or anything like that, but just doesn't that impress you with this lifelong learning? And not only learning about theology, but the ability to teach in a wonderful way. For many of us, you'd be aware of our religious education curriculum. Some people think that religious education is the teaching of religion in classrooms. We happen to believe it's much more than that. It's what happens in Catholic schools all day and every day, in classrooms, but also around our classrooms and in other locations. So I believe today, in inviting Peter to join us for this session today, you'll also have your eyes open to appreciate that religious education is more than the teaching of religion, and being in teaching in a Catholic school is more than just the teaching of religion, even though that's a very, very important part. So, would you join with me in making Peter feel very, very welcome?
Is that better now? Yeah. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And Di, thank you for the invitation to be with you today. I'm glad God is raining upon us, and particularly for this area of the country. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the Durable people who are the custodians on the lands on which we gather. For the past 6 years now at ACU, I had worked on a project with Professor Jim Gleeson called Identity and Curriculum in Catholic Education. And this project was funded by the Diocese of Queensland with funding from this diocese, the Sisters of Mercy, the Presentation Sisters and Edmund Rice Schools Australia. And it originally was an initiative that David Hutton, the prior director of Brisbane, and Professor Murray Emmett, the retired executive dean of education at ACU, had begun some conversations about more than 10 years ago. And their concern was, what is it in the general curriculum that we can bring a Catholic worldview or a Catholic perspective to? And so we started on this long program of what did it mean, what might it look like, are other people in the world doing these kind of things? So today I thought I'd walk you through some of that, and then we'll move to some very practical conversations about what you might be able to do in your schools to open up this area that I believe has slipped a little for us, and we need to pay some broader attention to it. So it's really related to areas of identity, because identity comes through the school curriculum in more than just religious education. As Di said, it's everything that happens within the school. So if someone said, you know, what are Catholic perspectives, I think we can start with a reflection from John's Gospel that says, you know, there are many rooms in my Father's house. Well, when we start to say what's the decor of that room and what might it look like, for some of us we struggle. In fact, I think many of us struggle. We might pick out one or two things and then we say, oh, but it's more than that. So really what happens in this Catholic room, for instance, is really a collage of beliefs and practices. So it's not just one thing, but it's multiple things, and it's also the way in which we remember and celebrate those events. So while it may be difficult to define Catholic identity, that shouldn't stop us from trying to define it and trying to make it explicit within our schools. But one of the things we need to do with identity is that we need to avoid oppositional identities. Now, oppositional identities are easy to do. When someone says to me, Peter, what's your sister like? I will say, she's 10 years younger than me, she has blonde hair, and she's a size 8. So they're everything that I'm not. Right? So I'm describing her as an opposite. And so one of the things that happens with identity, if we move into oppositional identities, we can very quickly fall into the space of we do this, but they do something else. And we're different because they don't do this. Right? Now that's not helpful. And so when we start to describe who and what we are, we need to be very cautious in how we do that. Often when I'm talking to young teachers in Catholic schools, particularly they say, I really like working here. It's a very caring place. Now, if a very caring place is the only way to describe Catholic schools, we're in a difficult position. Because for a number of years I worked in a government school and it was a very caring place too. So we need to be able to articulate what is specifically different about what we do in our schools and then how we do it. So Catholic perspectives across the curriculum came out of that kind of thinking about what is it in the curriculum that we needed to talk about and make more explicit. So we started to do some investigation around what have people said about Catholic identity. And in general, there are 4 major researchers in this field. And so I thought I'd just give you a very brief taste of what they're saying Catholic identity is about. So Andrew Greeley, Jerry Arbuckle, Thomas Groome and Lievenboever. And you would have probably heard of some of these people. And in fact, if you're involved in the Catholic Identity Project, yes. So Lievenboever was the theologian who underpinned part of the Leuven Catholic Identity Project. So we'll have a look at that as we go through. So Andrew Greeley is a Catholic priest and a sociologist. So the other thing we have to think about is we come to explain things from who and what we are. Right, so if you're coming from the position of a sociologist, you're going to explain Catholic identity differently from someone who comes as an educator, someone who comes as a theologian. Right? And I think it's helpful to see and talk about how this might be explained from areas outside of our own comfort zone. So Andrew Greeley talks about a Catholic imagination. Right, so when he talks about imagination, he's not talking about imagining things as in fairy tales, right? But he's talking about the way we view the world. So he's probably talking about a Catholic worldview, but in its broadest sense, he talks about it as an imagination. So we see the world through a particular set of lenses. And if we put the Catholic Christian glasses on, how do we see the world and how do we interpret the world? And he suggests that within Christianity itself, there are not many major doctrinal differences. Right? On the whole, all Christians believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead. Right? So that's fundamental. They're not going to argue about that bit. Right? But it's then how we interpret and retell that story is different in each of the Christian denominations. So he says that there's a distinctly Catholic worldview as there would be a distinctly Lutheran worldview. So one of the things he says about this Catholic worldview is that within the Catholic Christian tradition, we emphasize the presence of God in the world. Right? Now, some people would call that a sacramental view of life. Right? So this morning, as you looked out and saw the rain, some of you probably would have went, oh, thank God. Right? Now, that might have just been a statement, but it's also part of knowing that there's something bigger than us that makes this happen. Right? So the presence of God in the world, and that this Catholic imagination is hope-filled rather than hopeless. Right? Now, in the sense of being hope-filled, if God is present in the world, right, that is a hope-filled sign. The other part of that hope-filledness is that we are fundamentally good people. Right? Now, I'm not talking about whether we're morally good, but in essence, we're good. We stuff up, but in essence, we're good. The other thing that he talks about is that when we tell our story, right, this story of Catholic Christianity, we tell it through a variety of modes. Right? We don't just tell it in verbal language, we tell it visually. We tell it through our sacramental practices. We tell it through our ritual practices. Right? So there are multiple ways of telling this Catholic Christian story. And he says that our Catholic Christian story then is embedded and shaped by our culture. So the way we tell the Catholic Christian story in Australia is quite distinctive from the way that we might tell the Catholic Christian story in the Philippines or India or America or even New Zealand. That there are going to be unique elements that draw that telling, our telling, the Australian telling of the Catholic Christian story. So one of the things that he reminds us is that the Catholic imagination then is different from, but not superior to, any other way of telling the Christian story. Right? And that's where he highlights, be careful not to fall into oppositional identities. Right? We might tell it in a different way. It's different, but it's not superior to. So our second person who has done some research in this area, who would be familiar to many of you, is Tom Groom, a religious educator and theologian who works at Boston College. Now, Tom published a book a few years ago called 9 Things That Make Us Catholic. Right? So in this effort to say, what's in this room? Right? What's the collage? What's the furniture like in this room? And he says that there are 9 things. So he begins with is a positive understanding of the human person. That's not unlike being a hope-filled person. Right? So that every person is created good, and that we are fundamentally good people, and we should see the goodness in others. Now, for some of you on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, it might be a little of a strain to see the goodness in others, but on the whole, that's where we're at, that we see the goodness in others. Tom also talks about that this Catholic Christian commitment is lived out within community. It's not a thing that we do on our own. It's not a you and me God and forget about the rest of you, right? It's a you and me God in relationship with everybody else. And so how I treat and speak with other people reflects my relationship with God. And how that is lived out in community is significant. The third one that Tom talks about is a sacramental view of life. So this sacramental view of life is not the 7 big sacraments with the capital S, right? This is small s sacraments in the sense of recognizing the presence of God in the world. The aha moments of life. The birth of a child. I imagine if you were in Blackhall yesterday when it started to rain, it was probably a bit of a sacramental moment. Right? Recognizing God's presence in the world. So this sacramental outlook on life is significant for Catholic Christianity. The other thing he talks about is a combination of scripture and tradition. Scripture is central to how we know and understand the story of Jesus and how we know and understand our own tradition. But alongside that, going along with it is tradition. That this tradition is not static. Sometimes you might think it is, but it's not. This tradition is not static, that it shapes and develops over time, and it responds to the culture and the time in which it lives. Right? So we can see the example even related to Scripture. Prior to the late 1800s, we interpreted Scripture in a very narrow way. Today we say, and in fact, Pope Leo XIII said to us, you want to be careful about learning biblical languages, and you want to be careful about too much investigation into the history of where these texts came, because in fact it might destroy your faith. And 50 years later, at the Second Vatican Council, we said, no, this is what really helps you understand Scripture. So tradition shifts, and we interpret who and what we are within that tradition as it shifts and shapes and expands over time. So Scripture and tradition together. The other thing that Tom talks about is this is a holistic faith. It's not just a component of our lives. Right? It is the whole of our lives and how we live it in relationship with others. So it's not a thing we do for an hour once a week, right? But it should have an impact across the whole of our lives. And very much flowing from that is the commitment to justice, a commitment to make the world a better place, a commitment to change the structures that are oppressing people. He then also talks about it's a universal spirituality. And in a universal spirituality, we're going to pick up different elements of how this Catholic Christian tradition is expressed. Right? So I'm a Sister of Mercy. We express it in a particular way. The Maris brothers, the Christian brothers, the Brigidine sisters are all going to express Catholic Christianity in a slightly different way. But it's all one thing. And the big thing is focused on the resurrection of Jesus and the presence of God in the world. If we get so hung up in the charism, the one way that one particular group expresses it, sometimes we forget that God's in it and we're just concentrating on the founder of a particular group. So this universal spirituality is important. The next thing he talks about is that we are Catholic and Catholic with a small c, that we are universal, that it's not just how we do things here in Rockhampton or even how we do things here in Australia, that we belong to a worldwide church, and what does that mean and how do we interact with it? And the final one he talks about is the role of Mary, as in Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, within the tradition. That within the Catholic Christian tradition, over time, we have used Mary as a model for how we might be good and active disciples. Perhaps not what we've taught about her in the past as being very passive. You know, the angel comes, says to Mary, you're going to have a child. She says, sure thing. No. Right? What she said was, how can this be? Right? And then when she gets an answer to how can this be, she says, yes, I'm able to do this. So one of the things that we need to take from the role of Mary within the tradition is to ask some questions. And in asking questions, we better inform ourselves of the tradition, and then we are able to better explain it. So they're the 9 things of Tom Groom. Why don't you take just a moment for yourself? You've heard 2 so far. What are some things that might be standing out for you between the first one and the second one? Just take a moment.
You're happy to share your PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah, I meant to say that to you. Yeah. Okay. So the next theorist in this space, and by the way, I've just, I meant to say at the beginning, I'll forward the PowerPoint to Diane, and Diane, if you want it, just contact her or contact me directly, but you're welcome to it. So Jerry Arbuckle. Jerry Arbuckle is a Marist priest, and Jerry Arbuckle comes from the perspective of a cultural anthropologist, right? So he looks at how people operate in the world. And so Jerry started to do his investigations around Catholic identity related to Catholic hospitals. And so Catholic hospitals, in a way, have come to this conversation around identity within the institution a little bit earlier than Catholic schools. I often have this conversation with people at ACU around identity and what does it mean. And for many of us, Catholic schools, in the history of Australia, Catholic schools have had all the eggs in one basket, right? If there were going to be Catholics into the next generation, if they went to a Catholic school from the age of 5 to 17, well, then that would fix it all, right? They'd have it for life. We haven't thought much about lifelong education as far as the Catholic Church in Australia. And so, you know, when someone leaves school at 17, we think that's all the official engagement with church that they need other than turning up to Mass. And we know that that's probably not working and we need to do something different. So Catholic hospitals have come into that conversation too around what does it mean to be a Catholic hospital? It has to be more than not performing abortions and euthanizing people, right? They're important. But if they're the only two things that you describe yourself as, this is why we're Catholic, there's a lot missing in that space. So this is what Jerry Arbuckle started to try and unpack with Catholic hospitals. And so he says when you're trying to form an identity, a Catholic identity within a hospital or any large institution, that there's more than one way of doing it. And in fact, it might look different in different places. So he talks about not Catholic identity singular, but Catholic identities plural, right? And in fact, he talks about in the situations that he's looked at, that there were 13 ways that you could work with staff in approaching Catholic identities. But one of the things he talks about in particular is there's no one way of doing it. He's convinced of that. And the other bit he's convinced of is that you cannot impose it on people, that it has to be invitational. And in invitational, it's got to be expressed in multiple ways. So in being invitational, it's about how you do things and how you talk about things, and for schools, how you teach about things, right? So we need to make sure that what we're saying is invitational rather than imposing it on people. So, fourth one, Liebenbouwer. Liebenbouwer is a Belgian theologian, so his context is Europe, and context means a lot, right? But I think what we're learning from the European context is things that happened there 20 and 25 years ago are now happening here in Australia, right? So we can learn from the experience, right? So he says that Western Catholic Christianity has become de-traditionalized. Right, so when he talks about de-traditionalisation, they're the people who very willingly tick on the census form Catholic. Right, but what does it mean? Can they talk about the tradition? Do they know what the tradition is all about? Probably not. Right, so they may or may not go to Catholic schools. They may or may not be married in Catholic churches. They may or may not baptise their kids, but they're very happy to tick the box that's called Catholic. So what does that mean, and how do you talk about being Catholic in a de-traditionalised world where lots of people don't have the language to do that? So the other thing he talks about is that most people under 40, we often describe in Australia as unchurched, right? But he talks about them as, in Grace Davies' terms, as believing without belonging or being de-traditionalised. So those who believe without belonging are the people who say, I'm interested in spirituality but not in religion, right? That's a common sentence. And people who are de-traditionalised draw their ideas from multiple sources, which is a good thing, but you have to know where they've come from. Right? So in talking about meditation, they might say, oh yes, I pray and I use meditation, but their techniques might be from Buddhist meditation rather from the history of Catholic Christian meditation, but they don't know there's a difference. Right? So it kind of doesn't matter in a sense where it comes from, but you need to know what you're using and how you put it together. It's a bit like when you're cooking and you substitute something into a recipe, you've got to know that it's going to work and what it's going to do to everything else. So, in the past, religious identity has been somewhat generational. Right? Your parents, your children, their children. This is no longer the case, right, at all. Today, religious identity is formed a bit as if you're selecting stuff from a really great buffet. Right? And people are picking elements and creating their own identity within that and calling it something particular, or maybe not calling it anything particular at all. So Liebenbeaver talks about Fourwheel Catholics. Right? And he talks about how parents bring their baby for infant baptism to a church in a pram. The next time they might turn up to the churches for the first communion, but you're in your parents' car. And then you hire a limousine and you get married in a Catholic church. And then, if you're lucky, your family will bring you to a Catholic church again in a hearse for a funeral. Right? Now, this is his explanation of what's happened in Belgium. I think this has already happened in Australia. And I'm even wondering if we're down to a bicycle. You know, like what are the points when people make connections with church and what does it mean? So, 4 theorists, 4 ways of approaching what Catholic identity might be talking about. So, I'd invite you now just to take a couple of minutes on your own. Right? What elements of those 4 approaches resonate with you? What makes sense for you as an individual? So just take maybe about 2 minutes. So now that you might have got your own thoughts in order, why don't we go to what John Thornburn says, around the campfire. So now, as around the campfire, share some of those ideas with the people around you. So maybe in a group of, 4, 3 or 4. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Am I on? Yeah, I think so. So are there any comments or questions? Any comments or questions that you want to put to the floor about what you've talked about? Is it making sense? Is it not making sense? No? Any reflections? Yep, thank you. Which one's that? Doctrinally. Yeah. Sure. So if we start to talk about what's central, we're talking about belief in the death and resurrection of Jesus. We're talking about the Trinity, right? We diverge a little on sacraments, right? But they're kind of the essentials. We diverge a bit on Mary, the mother of Jesus, right? But if we talk about who and what God is, as in Trinity, essentially people are agreeing on that within Christianity, right? Right? How they express it and how they talk about it might be different, but the belief is there. Yeah. So does that make a bit of sense for you? Yeah. Yes. Hmm. Depended on where you lived when the split took place. Yeah. Yep. Hmm. And I think the other part of it is we're human. We stuff up, but we have to try to express it in the best way we can, right? So while we are good, we're not perfect. And we have to work at our goodness, if you like, to live that out in the world. Yeah. And sometimes it will be a bit more difficult than others. Yep. Yeah. I was going to say it'd be a heavy read. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah, it's a great image. Yeah. Sorry, I saw a hand up somewhere. Yeah.
I was just under the impression that earlier books of Thomas Groome, that there was one of the defining characteristics of Catholicism was the attempt to reconcile faith and reason. That doesn't appear to be in the 9 points that he raises anymore. My impression was 20 years ago with his first publication, that was also a defining characteristic, that there is a push within Catholicism to embrace human intellectuality and try and negotiate a path to faith using a way that was quite unique to Catholicism and not to the other faiths.
And that's true. I don't think he's really dropped it out, but he hasn't named it as a defining feature, but he would talk about the combination of faith and reason in all of those 9 elements. So when we start to talk about what it means to be Catholic, we have to engage both the head and the heart, right? Or we end up like Maria Harris, the American religious educator, used to say to people, do you want to make kids strong in the heart but soft in the head? Right? And she said, you need both. Right? You need to get them to be able to think about it. See, in fact, this is what, at best, the old catechism stuff was all about. We just thought it was about rote learning. But in fact, while you learnt the stuff, the idea is that you had a language, you were religiously literate at one level. But if the catechism was taught well, it meant that you could move into apologetics. And apologetics was being able to, with reason, define what all of this means and, if need be, argue a case when someone put up the opposite. Right? So to be religiously literate means to have the content, to be able to use it in specific contexts, but then to critique what we're saying about ourselves as well in the light of conversations we have with others. And so this is kind of tied into the faith and reason idea that Groom talks about, and how it's underpinned by all of these external expressions of it, if you like. Yeah. Oh. Okay, shall we move on? So this idea of faith-based identity is really becoming quite significant in all sorts of Catholic institutions across the world. So if we start to think of identity, right, it's the core of who you are. It's what we look like, right? It's the families we've come from. It's how we express it. The bit we haven't really paid a lot of attention to is that identity comes through the curriculum that we engage with in schools as well. And I'll talk a little bit about this as we go through. So we also personally have different identities in different contexts, right? So you are, many of you are a parent, a child, an aunt or an uncle, a sports coach, a teacher, a principal. They're all different identities that you bring with who and what you are. Right? So there are various ways in which you express yourself, and all of them make up who you are. So if we're talking about Catholic schools, what are all the things that express that identity? And what you do from 9 in the morning till 3 is engage with the formal curriculum. Right? So what is it within the formal curriculum that we might not be paying specific enough attention to related to Catholic identity? So if we're talking about institutional identities, we have this thing around the founding story. What is the founding story all about, and how do we articulate it? I think we've got a grip on some of that. We're pretty good at symbolic and ritual markers. Right? What are the things that we celebrate? What does a school look like from the outside? I go into lots and lots of schools, and I get a very clear feel when I walk into the front office of a school as to what that school is like. Right? If I walk into the front office and all the trophy cabinets are filled with football trophies, it's a very different feeling from walking in to where there might be arts trophies along with football trophies, along with what people are doing in the justice space, right? It sends a message to people, right? So symbolic and ritual markers are important. The other thing too is, how do we encourage and enable responsible dissenters who ask those really hard questions about the tradition? So within the theological perspectives of it, people would call it going into something with a hermeneutic of suspicion, right? Asking what might be left out or covered up, right? If you're in the literacy space, you're going to be asking the same questions around the hermeneutic of suspicion when you ask the question of how are we being positioned as readers or viewers, right? What's shaping our perspective here? Right? And so sometimes the person you might think who is a little bit of a pain in the neck at the staff meeting may be asking a very valuable question related to identity that we just haven't paid enough attention to. But what does it really mean? And then those questions about how we express the narrative, right? And how this looks like. So the formal and informal curriculum of a school is significant. Right, so Elliot Eisner talks about the 3 curricula we all teach. The explicit, right, so that's your general curriculum documents. The implicit curriculum, which can be related to timetabling, for instance, when you put something on. Right, so when you have to have a full school assembly, what's the subject that's always cancelled? Right, that's implicit curriculum. Right, and the null curriculum, the things we teach by not teaching them, the things we haven't even thought about. Right? And I can give you an example of that. I was working with a group of teachers in Cairns the other day around the 2 Genesis creation accounts. And we were looking at the second Genesis creation account, what we know as the Adam and Eve creation account. And at the end of that story it says, and they were both naked but not ashamed. Now they were doing a detailed read, so they were circling stuff that kids might ask questions about or what they might need to find out themselves about. No one circled that last statement. And I said to them, what about, and they were naked but not ashamed? Oh, we don't do that bit, was the response. Well, what is that saying about human sexuality, right? And what kind of a message is happening there, right? So what we teach and what we don't teach about this is really significant. But what is coming together in this identity space, and particularly what is being made very clear throughout the history of Catholic education, as it's talked about from the Congregation of Catholic Education, is that identity is a synthesis of faith and culture. And what might that look like in our schools? So, a generation ago, we weren't talking about this at all. Right? And a generation ago, schools were very different places. Predominantly, Catholic schools had at least a sprinkling of religious, and we kind of thought they'll look after all of that. Okay. That we're a Catholic school because we pray together. We're a Catholic school because we have religious education. Right? We're a Catholic school because we care about people. Right? So what he calls this is the assimilationist approach. We do exactly the same as everybody down the road, but we do it better. Right? Now that was his comment of Catholic schools in the United Kingdom. Maybe just take a buzz on that point. Okay? So what have other people said about this? So the Congregation for Catholic Education, the formal body in Rome that talks about Catholic education, and some of you might think, well, what do they actually know about it? So the Congregation for Catholic Education formed post the Second Vatican Council. right? And so there were thousands of Catholic schools across the world, and they thought that they would just hop along and do whatever they were going to do and it would be okay. So the congregation was formed after the Second Vatican Council, when we had the first document on Catholic education. And then it decided there needed to be a place of research, a place of thinking about Catholic education in the world. And since then, they've published a number of documents that have tried to provide insight to those working in Catholic education and to identify some challenges, right? Because sometimes we just view the world from where we're standing, and often it's good to get another view of the world. So in 1977, the document The Catholic School came out, and it said, the curriculum of a Catholic school is the synthesis of culture and faith and a synthesis of faith and life. All academic subjects can contribute to the development of a mature Christian. 1977. Okay. And then in 2013, these documents are readily available on the Vatican website, Educating for Intercultural Dialogue in Catholic Schools, Living in Harmony for a Civilization of Love. They said this: it is important for Catholic schools to be aware of the risks that arise should they lose sight of the reasons why they exist. This can happen, for example, when they unthinkingly conform to the expectations of a society marked by the values of individualism and competition. Catholic schools are called to give dutiful witness by their pedagogy. I'll give you a minute to reread it. They go on to say, the curriculum is how the school community makes explicit its goals and objectives. In the curriculum, the school's cultural and pedagogical identity are made manifest. And then it says, Catholic schools are encouraged to promote a wisdom-based society, to go beyond knowledge and to educate people to think, evaluating facts in the light of values. Right? So in a Catholic school, in the light of Catholic Christian values. The curriculum must help students to reflect on the great problems of our time, including humanity's living conditions. Right? They're pretty strong statements. Right? All in the one document. Right? That we unthinkingly conform to the expectations of a society marked by individualism and competition. Right? This is what we do when we put up the rankings related to how many OP1s you get in your school, or this is to do with your NAPLAN results. Right? The curriculum is how you make your identity explicit. We need to go beyond educating people, right, to helping them to think and to critique society in the light of Catholic Christian values. Okay, this is John Thorburns' thing of into the cave, right? So into the cave is when you're just thinking about this for yourself. I'll give you a couple of minutes of into the cave, and then we'll go round the campfire. All right, so given these statements, what resonates with you or what really challenges you? So a couple of minutes in the cave. Sure. Okay, time for the campfire. Go to your groups, small conversation groups. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So what resonated with you? Any comments from the floor on something that resonated with you? Yep.
I was struck is that we are in the two worlds.
Yeah.
There is that competitive school world, and that's why many of our staff can come to our schools. Like it's schizophrenic.
And how we address that is important. So I'm not saying that results aren't important. Right? I'm saying results are important, but how you go about that and how you enable that to happen within your school should be expressing who and what you are. Yeah. Any other, what resonates with me? Okay, let me move to the what challenges me. Because if you actually think about some of what's in that document, I find it very confronting as an educator. You know, when you look at something like move beyond knowledge and educate people to think, evaluating facts in the light of values, then we have to ask whose values, right? So if we're in a Catholic school, what are these values that we promote? And then our pedagogy and how we do that enables or doesn't enable some of that to happen. All right, so this is some of the big questions. So, John Convey from the USA, he's provided a model of how he sees Catholic schools. All right, now predominantly, he says he sees Catholic schools as people first. And then from people, you can get a division into content and culture. And then his subdivision under content comes to the RE program and the general curriculum. And under culture, he talks about faith, community service, ritual and symbols. Now, what he says is that we've spent all of our time concentrating on faith and community service and ritual and symbols, which we might call the religious life of the school or the whole school community. And we spend a lot of our time focusing on the RE program, the teaching in classrooms, and then the wider religious life of the school. And he says, as related to identity and culture, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about the general curriculum. And he says, and now we're at this point in time where we need to talk about what's happening in the general curriculum. And we're not unique in this space. Ontario Catholic education got full funding to Catholic schools in 1986. We thought we were great in the 1960s. Right? So in 1986, they got full funding Catholic schools. Prior to that, Catholic school teachers were paid quite significantly different amounts of money. But when they got full funding, it meant they were employed by the state. And so all of your school boards in Ontario in particular, but across the whole of Canada, are voted in at local elections, right? You don't go and kind of tap someone on the shoulder, right? So your funding can almost disappear overnight. So in Nova Scotia, for instance, there are no Catholic schools left. All right, they were just voted out. So still called St Matthew's, but it's a government school today, not a Catholic school. Right, so Ontario started to really think about this because in getting full funding, they picked up the state curriculum, they had to teach the state curriculum, and then they also had to prove how they were different. Right, they had to demonstrate their identity was different from any other school. And so they started to reflect on the process. And I know it's small print, but I'll just read this to you. This is them talking about themselves. Like the Hebrew slaves emerging from the wilderness of Sinai, we saw in the distance a land flowing with milk and honey. If we remember our scriptures, however, we will recall that after they entered the promised land, the former slaves gradually forgot who they were, where they'd come from, and what work they were called to do. They became preoccupied with building palaces, collecting taxes, and establishing a kingdom. As material well-being grew, their unique religious identity and moral imperative was diminished. They lost touch with their roots. Over time, they became virtually indistinguishable from their neighbours. They managed to survive as a people only by remembering their covenant with God in the desert, preserving and enshrining the covenant in their laws and institutions, and interpreting it in the context of their new conditions. They realised that they had been freed from being slaves to the Pharaoh so that they might become the servants of God. I think it's a lovely way of describing what happened to Catholic education after they got full funding. And then all of a sudden, they remembered, well, is this what we're supposed to be? Right? Take another minute. They became virtually indistinguishable from their neighbours. So they didn't leave it at that. They decided to ask some questions and to re-articulate their identity. And so one of the things they came up with was that they saw that there could be three possible ways to move forward. And they identified these as separation, permeation, and integration. So separation is when you say, we're a Catholic school because we have religious education. So the subject, religious education, in the curriculum carries the burden, in inverted commas, of Catholic identity and what it means to be Catholic. Right? They rejected that model, right, because they said that's not going to work. Okay? They then decided there was the permeation model. So this was the whole school task. Right? So this is what Queenslanders might generally call the religious life of the school. What justice projects do we do? How often do we have full school assembly with prayer? You know, do we have full school masses? Right? That's the permeation approach. It works, but it's not perfect. Then they looked at integration, and this is a cross-curricular task. Right? So this is where they said, where do we explicitly, where most appropriately, make Catholic links into the general curriculum so that the curriculum is transformative? Right? That we might ask some questions about the novels we choose to teach. Or we might stay with the same novels we're teaching, but we're going to ask some other questions about them. What examples do we use in mathematics when we're teaching fractions? And how do we unpack that? What is it about the curriculum that we can make explicit a form of Catholic identity? Now, this is not learning to count angels instead of ducks, right? That's not it, right? It has to be meaningful. Right? So you can't do Pythagoras' theorem and say, hey, he too was interested in religion. Right? That's not going to work. Right? It has to be meaningful and in-depth. Right? So they decided that they should be looking at an educational philosophy that was interdisciplinary. Right? Now this will appeal to primary people. We say we do that all the time. Right? Some secondary people will say we do it sometimes. Right? Secondaries are tending to be more siloed, We would like to think it's not like that, but right. So interdisciplinary work where religious themes and ideas and understandings are included in the conversation about this. Now, in order to do it then, your teachers have to be adequately prepared to have this conversation. Right? So this whole idea of religious literacy has to be spread across the whole of your staff, and it needs to be given the attention it deserves. Right? So that's the position Ontario Catholic Education took up, that they decided to go with integration, formal curriculum integration. So Catholic perspectives across the curriculum then, they are not the cherry on top of the cake. Because after you take the cherry off, you've still just got the cake. All right, looks good. All right, we can show it off in our paperwork. All right, but that's not it. Catholic perspectives across the curriculum has to be like the yeast in the dough. That you mightn't always be able to see it explicitly, but it makes a really big difference to the end product. And in the integration, you have to work hard to knead it in. You don't just plop it in. Right? It's not going to work like magic. Right? There's a lot of hard work associated with kneading the yeast through. And again, these two images aren't perfect, but I think they help us think about what integration, curriculum integration, is all about. And then they come from very important foundations related to Catholic schools. That Catholic schools are places of learning and believing. And what does that mean in the wider sense? That Catholic school doesn't have to tell people what to think, but it should develop in students methods and approaches of critical reflection. What does it mean to ask some big questions about the times in which we live? Right? And how is that critical reflection shaped? Catholic schools intentionally inform people. We teach them stuff. And in teaching them stuff, we're actually forming them as people. Right? So what kind of people do we want to form? And that's related to more than the prayer life of the school. The prayer life of the school is important, but we're also teaching them things in the general curriculum. So the knowledge within Catholic schools then shouldn't ever be reduced to a know-how approach for the sake of productivity. Right? And schools, and particularly schools in Australia, and how curriculum is being shaped in Australia at the moment, is heading down this pathway. Right? So what is it within a Catholic school that we're going to do to open that up and ask some other questions? Because Catholic schools have two dimensions. They're a public community. Right? And in being a public community, they talk about social responsibility, and surely in talking about social responsibility, we want to ask some questions about the marginalised on society, and we want to encourage people to contribute to the common good, not just the personal good. But schools are also ecclesial communities, church communities, and they're not just linked to the church within this diocese, but they're linked to the church throughout the world. This is where it comes to that big question back in that 2013 document that says, you know, how do these kids learn about the world, and why do they care about what's happening to other people in the world? So then we come to this rub about curriculum. Curriculum is never values neutral. Right? And while some of us may pick up a curriculum and read the shape paper, right, and then read the rationale, 90% of us pick up the curriculum and go, what do I have to do in year 9? What do I have to do in year 3? Right? We go to the business end of it. But there's a whole lot of other stuff that's shaped that curriculum. And it's going to have a perspective on how people operate in the world. So it's a product of someone's thinking and believing. So in a Catholic school, why wouldn't we think about thinking and believing in that context as well? Take a minute to have a conversation around your campfire. okay? So in addressing this idea that curriculum is never neutral, right, Ontario Catholic Education decided to ask a few questions about if they were going to pick up, if they weren't satisfied with separation, if they didn't think that permeation was the only way to go, that they also wanted full integration, they had to be able to work a process that would work for students. And so they went back to, I've just lost my spot, that's all right. So they went back to look at what integration might mean. So for integration, they were talking about integrating knowledge, values, and skills and adding a religious dimension to learning, a meaningful perspective. That most subject areas they decided in schools avoided any kind of link with anything religious other than religious education. Right? So how would you bring, and they were presenting a truly secular worldview. Right? So if you pick up the Australian curriculum, that's what you've got. Right? So what is it that you're going to bring to it? And so then you have to ask questions like, well, is the relationship with religion and business, or Catholic identity and business, Catholic identity and science, Catholic identity and citizenship? What might that mean? So you've got to understand it and articulate it, and then you've got to visibly integrate it into the curriculum. So there are 4 tasks of the Christian community. And in the 4 tasks of the Christian community, it says that when we talk about kerygma, that we teach, preach, and evangelize. Now, for a number of us, we might think preaching and evangelizing is the only stuff that goes in with kerygma, right? But it's teaching as well. So there's your whole school curriculum. That in koinonia, we are witnessing to the whole communities, and we're probably not too bad at that, right? That's your whole school. In your liturgy, you're probably not too bad at that either, right? And in your diaconia, your care of the rest of the community, right? We're pretty focused on that. But we need to go back to this first one, that it's more than preaching and evangelizing, it's also teaching. So the Ontario people went back to a statement from the bishops of the USA, because they said, how would we bring this and make it tangible for teachers in schools? So the bishops in the USA had said earlier, there are many innovative efforts by Catholic educators to communicate the social doctrine of the church, the social teachings of the church. At the same time, however, it's clear that in some education programs, Catholic social teaching is not really shared or sufficiently explicit and integral. As a result, far too many Catholics are not familiar with the basic content of CST. More fundamentally, more Catholics do not adequately understand that the social teaching of the Church is an essential part of the Catholic faith. This poses a serious challenge for all Catholics, since it weakens our capacity to be a church that is true to the demands of the gospel. So Ontario Catholic Education picked that up. And they said, why don't we try to use Catholic social teaching as the integrating element? Right? So then they had to do some investigations around what Catholic social teaching as an integrating element would be. So they worked with the 6 principles or themes of Catholic social teaching. Now, depending, if you Google it, you'll get 6, 7, 8, 9, even up to 12. Right? But Caritas puts them into a grouping of 6. It's a nice grouping to work with schools, because what Ontario did was they allocated 1 theme per year level. So that you might, and we'll go through the themes, but if you were doing human dignity, you might have dealt with it in year 1, and then you came back to it again in year 7 or year 8. You had this cycle. So you had this expanding spiral of kids engaging with these themes. Okay? So the themes themselves are related to human dignity. Right? So human dignity means that we're made in the image and likeness of God, out of Genesis 1. So if we're made in the image and likeness of God, that means we're a reflection of God in the world, right? So go back to groom stuff, right, of this positive anthropology. So if we're a reflection of God in the world, we have a duty in a way to behave as God would behave, right? Think about it. So it relates to how people are treated in working conditions. What's a just and valuable way to look at people related to work? What does it mean when we see inhumane treatment of workers? What does it mean when we're buying those goods, right, as a consumer? When it talks about rights and duties, how does that play out within a political system? What does it mean in reference to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights? Right? What people don't know about the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is that there was significant Catholic input into that. Jacques Maritain, the Catholic philosopher who was at the time ambassador to the Vatican, was one of the key writers of the Declaration of Human Rights. So this idea of human dignity just doesn't come out of the ether. It comes out of an understanding of being made in the image and likeness of God. So then human dignity expands to ideas of authentic human development. This is the terminology that's being used at the moment in the Vatican. So authentic human development is not just about economic growth, it's about social welfare as well. So Pope Francis has moved, you heard me talk earlier about the Congregation for Catholic Education. We used to have a Congregation for Social Justice, right, and a Congregation for Welfare. There were lots of congregations. Pope Francis has decided that that was too siloed, so he's now given them a new name and amalgamated them, and he's called it the Dicastery of Authentic Human Development. So he's brought the economists together, the justice people together, the people that are looking into child slavery. They're all in the one building now, and they're all having cross-fertilized conversations about what can be done. So that's what authentic human development is about. Right? So you've got to have clean water, but you've also got to have schooling. You've also got to have some rules to do with democracy and government. How do you bring all of that into line? And Pope Francis then particularly talks about human dignity in Laudato Si, when he talks about anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism is when we think we're the centre of the world and we can do whatever we want. So that's related to rampant consumerism. Right? So that's about the human dignity of everybody, which links into the common good. Right? So the common good is not something of the good added up and we get the average. Right? The common good is about, is this good for everyone? Whose voices in the conversation are being heard or not heard? Think about when you're teaching, citizenship in year 3 or senior economics. If you're not talking about the common good and asking some questions about who's in the conversation and who's not, right, they're big issues. That's bringing a Catholic perspective into the curriculum. The common good goes beyond people to the world, to how the environment operates. So if you're talking sustainability, which is one of the threads through the Australian curriculum, why aren't we talking about sustainability related to the common good as well? Right? All these opportunities are there. Preferential option for the poor, right? Sometimes we think preferential option for the poor is I can opt in or out of this. No, but the option is I am opting for. My first preference is to ask what's happening to the poor and marginalised. Now that could do with working conditions, that could do with environmental conditions, that could do with people with disabilities, that could be people, elderly people. That's related to some questions why the Catholic Church is commenting on what's happening in aged care facilities at the moment. That's part of preferential option for the poor. right? Who is going to speak on their behalf and for them? Preferential option for the poor too grows out of Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, right? So every educator talks about Freire and pedagogy of the oppressed. But Freire will tell you himself that this was influenced by his belief stance as a Catholic and what was happening within Latin America. And while the theologians were talking about it theologically, he was talking about the same things educationally and how that played out. And so he talks about the model of social analysis of see, judge and act, the old Cardine model, right, that's used in religious education when kids are looking at social justice issues about what's happening in the world, the see bit. The judge bit is let's reflect on it. What do I need to know? What more do I need to find out about it? Now that I know this, what am I going to do about it immediately and in the long term? Go to your HASS syllabus. Your HASS syllabus says from year 4 onwards, what models of decision making are students going to use to investigate these issues? There's one model of decision making that enables people to bring in a conversation about what the tradition has said about this and how might you have a particular lens on explaining that. Stewardship of creation. Right? Why don't we in Catholic schools call sustainability stewardship of creation? Because that's what it is. Right? And why do we care about it? Because we are co-creators with God in the environment. JP2 taught us that, John Paul II. As co-creators with God, we are still creating the world. Right? Now we might ask some questions about what's happening to that. What's happening with our consumerism? Are we good co-creators or not? Right? And Laudato Si very clearly names that for us, that it's not just about care of the environment, but it's also about what's happening to the poor, because poverty and the environment are very closely linked. And therefore, what I do under global solidarity, under this theme, is that I am my brothers and sisters' keepers, that I should be caring what's happening to people in Bangladesh, that I should be asking some questions about what's happening to people in China, right? And how do I raise those issues and what do I do? And then subsidiarity and participation is very clearly linked with citizenship. Right? How do I make decisions? So when we're hell-bent on teaching about citizenship, right, what does that mean and how do we become active citizens within that process? Yeah, sorry.
Is there any entry barriers very political in regards to perspective?
Isn't curriculum political? But how do we get to open that conversation up? It can be, but it need not be.
Yes, I agree with you, it shouldn't be.
So it's how we use the examples. I'm being deliberately provocative with you. Right?
Well, we can't be deliberately provocative and nuanced, I suppose.
I think the word is nuanced in it, but we need to provide them with contestable materials. We need to do that even within religious education. We do select the materials. So what are the questions we're asking about the materials? Right? Is this just my perspective in this material? Let me give you an example. So when I was writing some stuff for one of the SOR textbooks, we were supposed to write something related to how people's religious beliefs impacted on their social action. Right, so we chose John Flynn, you know, as in the Flying Dr. John Flynn, right? So John Flynn is a Presbyterian, right? He was a committed Presbyterian. Right, so we wrote this section in the textbook that said, you know, his Christian faith influenced his establishment of the Flying Doctor service because from his Christian perspective, he wanted to help people. No sooner had we published that than a major set of research came out around John Flynn, which very clearly, from his own words, said he'd set up the Flying Doctor service for white people only, and they were never to serve Aboriginal people. So then we had a problem, right? So what do you then do with kids? Well, what we had to do was, well, here's one worldview of what John Flynn was like. Here's another worldview. Let's unpack this. Is he extremely racist? Is he racist along with how everybody was racist at that time? What does racism mean? How is it played out? Now, that's what I mean by contestable materials, that you're presenting students with an array of stuff that they then, through the skills that you've developed and taught them, are making up their own minds about them. For me to say John Flynn did this because he was a good Christian, right, and ignoring the other part of it is not the way to go. So we do have to ask, and this is the stuff that Freire asks about, what are the materials we are choosing to use with students, and how do our own biases, in a sense, come across within that? Right? So the Catholic Church has this issue as well. So there are scripture scholars who are saying one thing, there are others who are saying something else. There's a range of perspectives, right? We need to present the range of perspectives, and then we have to educate students in how they deal with that and help them to reach an informed decision, not just a decision they're going to grab at from the ether. And that's partly what Catholic social teaching is about. That how do you open up the conversation in order that people can make informed decisions, right? And it will be tough in some places. But I think the other part of it is that sometimes we don't understand Catholic social teaching as much as we need to. You know, like how many of us remember that it was the first Catholic social teaching document that said, from Leo XIII, that said workers have the right to form a union to negotiate a just day's wage for a just day's pay, right? Because they were being exploited. So solidarity and participation, the final one, is about subsidiarity and participation, is about making decisions at an appropriate level, right? Teachers are very into subsidiarity, right? You're going to do what happens in your classroom at 9:15 each morning in what's best for your students. And some of those decisions will be made by you, and then other decisions about what time you're going to break for morning tea, for instance, might be made at the school level. But what's the most appropriate level for where these decisions will be made? So, Catholic social teaching on the whole provides us with some principles for reflection, some criteria for judgment, and some guidelines in how people might take some action in this space. So, if we did some integration options, right? So this is some of the stuff we trialled in the projects with schools. So you could select a Catholic social teaching theme and you could inject it into an existing unit. Or you could use, so this is where your curriculum development stuff comes in, you can use a multidisciplinary unit. So visually they'd look like this. Here's my existing unit of work, and I select a CST theme, a Catholic social teaching theme, which I think matches with this unit, and I intentionally plan bits into it, right? Or other teachers worked around this model. So they said, no, I think the theme for me is the common good. And then I can start to work out what my literacy happens here, what's going to happen in numeracy, what's going to happen in RE, and how that connects to my major theme. Right? You see the difference in the planning process? So what I'd like you to do now in your groups of 4 or 5 is to do a SWOT analysis of those two models. Right? What are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats of what I call the injection model, right? Where the CST theme gets injected in. And then what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities of threats of where you put a theme at the centre and then you relate it that way. So this is going to take you a little bit of time. All right, so SWOT analysis in groups of 4, and you've got a handout there, and it's on pages 5 of your handout. Okay. Can we get some feedback on this one first? Right, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats from the injection model. Your existing unit of work, and you intentionally integrate explicitly one of the CST themes in. So you might be doing a, let me just give you some examples from the teachers who worked with it. So year 6 teachers doing their civics and citizenship stuff on the prep to go to Canberra unit did subsidiarity and participation. So they had this existing unit of work, and then they talked about subsidiarity and participation related to that explicitly in that unit. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. What do you say? What's a strength?
The fact that they're already comfortable with obviously
Yep.
something they already know.
Yep.
So it may be just easier to then add a new layer in.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's already something they're familiar with.
Thank you. Anything else in a strength?
Makes it achievable.
Mm-hmm.
It's a small step. It's a learning a small piece of knowledge to
Yep.
you don't have to rethink everything.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully you're already doing parts of it.
Mm-hmm.
As
Yep.
explicitly as that.
Weaknesses? Yeah. So you then have to think about, under opportunities, what might we need to do so that this is not just a surface treatment? Yep.
Just the understanding of it from
Yep.
the education and staff,
Yes,
so it doesn't just become a token step.
exactly. Yep.
Going to be realistic.
Yes. And so it might be that I'm a welded on person related to stewardship. And so that everything I do is naturally going to be talking about stewardship, but I might leave the others and never touch them. Right? You know, so if it's just left up to the teacher and the unit of work, right, it can be a little ad hoc in that space. Okay, if we went to this model, right, now we worked with some teachers who did this as well. So this, in a sense, worked when all of the year 4 teachers got together and did their group planning. So their focus shifts from this is what I'm going to do in literacy, and this is what I'm going to do in numeracy, and this is what's happening in RE, to say, no, here's the theme we're going to address for this 6-week or this term period, and then I'll think about what I'm going to add into it. Right, so I'll give you an example. This was a year 4 example to do with HAS particularly, but they managed to link everything in. So it was the common good. It was about the opening up of a new housing estate not far from the school and what was going to be good for everybody. So they talked about in RE, right, what did the common good mean and how did it relate? So it matched to one of their RE units of work that was happening at the time. Then in numeracy, their mathematical stuff was related to percentage of people in the area, you know, who was coming, who wasn't. They then did something in the arts. Their literacy books were related to what ideas to do with the common good. So they picked some text for students that was related to what's good for everybody rather than just what's good for one person. Their technology, in fact, was linked to RE because when it came time to do that, class was rostered on prayer for assembly that year, that term. They worked their technology into their RE and their prayer. And so one of the things we asked the teachers was, what was it like for you in planning it? And the initial kind of conversation said, we thought it would be a really lot of work. But in fact, when we did it, it wasn't. That we were actually getting more connections than we had previously thought, which kind of surprised us. You know, that was a good thing. So let's just look at a SWOT analysis of this model. It does turn your thinking upside down, because you're not starting with the subject areas. You're starting with a theme. Now, sometimes that's easier or not for people. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats in this one?
As much at surface level.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you put it in what your staff is.
Yes, yeah. And isn't that with anything? Yep. Yep. Any other comments? Yeah. Yes. Yep. Yes. True. Yeah. So there's going to be a difference between primary and secondary here. Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
We were a bit concerned just about the, once again, asking teachers to perhaps change a particular approach in the planning. So it was really around that. That's why I think one of the concerns was that, say, literacy and numeracy might not receive the attention
Yep.
and excitement that it might.
Yep.
It could be
Mm.
focus on other particular areas leached over.
Yep. Sure.
I've been a bit concerned that the stability of some of the disciplines might be lost.
Mm-hmm. In some ways, this model is more about thinking about how you go about it. Right? This one feels comfortable for us because we have this unit of work, we know it works, and we'll just add this bit to it. This one is changing your thinking, right? Where you're starting to get a more interdisciplinary view of the world. Now, the worst part of interdisciplinary work is an example of, I once worked in a school with integrated studies, you know, and everything kind of got shoved into year 8 and year 9. It was a bit of a disaster, right? That's not what I would think this has to look like, right? Where you get so integrated that you don't know what anything is anymore, right? You still need to maintain the disciplines around the outside.
Peter, we thought that probably informed by yesterday's around, starting small and building confidence and capacity, because it's about professional development formation for staff, that you might in fact end up with the capability to do this, but that
you might have to start in a different place.
Start with the other.
Yep.
To actually start to.
Yeah.
The journey.
Okay, some other thoughts in this space. One of the things is it comes down to a selection of resources. Right now, sometimes you might have to find a new resource. Other times you might be using your same resources, but you're going to ask some additional questions about it. So Ontario had this thing, we went to Ontario, so we looked at the paperwork and then we went to see, well, what is it really like on the ground? And admittedly, we're only there for 2 weeks, but we went to 5 secondary schools and 5 elementary schools, right? And they'd been working on this for about 10 years. And remember, this is where you allocate a theme per year level, a CST theme per year level. Right, so I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one was a library lesson for year 3. It was the middle of the baseball finals. The Toronto Blue Jays were into the semi-finals of the baseball for the first time in about 20 years. So Toronto was just baseball crazy. So I walked into this library lesson and there was a map of the world on the board with bits of string going out to all sorts of places. Kids came in and sat on the floor, the teacher was with them, and the library technician was taking the lesson. So the librarian says to the kids, do you have to be Canadian to play in the Blue Jays? Oh, no. And of course, then they started to name who were all the players in the Blue Jays, and where they were from, hence all these bits of wool out from Toronto to the rest of the world, including one bit of wool that went from Toronto to Australia. So one of the players was Australian. And then she went on to say, well, yes, but that wasn't always the case. And she picked up the picture book that she was to use with the year 3s. And the picture book was the story of the first African American who had played in the big league. And this was his story of how originally he had been excluded from playing, how when he finally got into the big league, he had to stay at different hotels than everybody else, how sometimes when he came onto the field, people booed him, right? So, as the pages are being turned, and the kids are riveted to this story, and this little boy says, "That's against human dignity." And I kind of went, whoa, that's impressive. And then it didn't stop at that point. The teacher then said, what do you mean by human dignity? So the year 3 boy at what, 7 or 8, says, God created everybody equal, but we're all different. Now, it's not a bad description of human dignity at an 8-year-old, but they had those conversations constantly. So when we finished, they finished the lesson, and this kind of conversation happened about, racism related to human dignity, all sorts of things from the picture book. When we finished, the teacher said, this is one of our mentor texts. And I said, I've heard people talk about mentor texts, but what are they? And she said, oh, no, this is just a picture book that a few teachers got together and looked at a series of picture books and said, what Catholic social teaching theme could we draw out of this picture book? They stuck an envelope in the back cover of the picture book, and they had an A4 page that gave the teacher who picked up that picture book bullet points about how they could bring out the ideas related to human dignity and what it related to. Now, apparently, in order to do that, once a month at a staff meeting, teachers would talk about what picture books they were using in the primary school and what theme it related to, and they just built it up as a group within the staff. Right? So that was one form of mentor text they talked about. In secondary schools, their new HAS curriculum had just come out. And so it was published by one of these multinational publishing companies, and everybody in Canada uses the same textbook, right? Government and church schools, right? And they're a bit textbook driven in that space. So the publishing company came to the Catholic school system and said, we know that you're talking about Catholic social themes across the curriculum. We will reprint the textbook for you if you can give us 2 teachers to work on the textbook. Now, all they did was they ruled a column down the side of the textbook, and where it matched, they said, when you're talking about this issue, this is to do with stewardship, and they'd have 2 or 3 bullet points related to stewardship. When you're teaching this, this is to do with global solidarity. Here's your points about global solidarity. Right? That was called a mentor text. Secondaries, I saw an hour-and-a-half physics lesson related to wind turbines on the lakes of Ontario that related to the common good and option for the poor. Right? So they still taught their physics lesson, but there were questions raised around the common good and option for the poor as part of that physics lesson. There was an art class that I went to where the students had just finished, not going to be right art terminology here, but they were portraits made out of like micro calligraphy. So they had to choose a statement from a famous person, and then that statement became the outline of their face in the micro words part of it. What I was astounded by is that I think 80% of the images were prominent Catholics who had said something about what was happening in the world. Right? And then the kids had to give a justification as to why they'd chosen that person and what did their statement mean, and, develop that way. So it was quite overt, it was quite visible, and they had worked it through with this one theme per year. So by the time, and they have 13 years of school, so by the time you get to year 12, you've done each theme twice, and then you've got the conversation of what happens in the previous year that comes into that. So when we started to work on this project in the last 5 years with schools volunteering to be part of it, we started with teachers doing units of work. And then we asked some questions about what if you went to a whole school approach? Right, so a whole school approach could be one Catholic social teaching theme per term for the whole school. It could be one per year. Right? It could be one per semester. Because if you leave it to individual teachers, it can be very hit and miss. Right? So now, if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes around a SWOT analysis about what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of whole school approaches to this, and what would it look like, right? So a SWOT analysis related to a whole school approach. A few minutes in your groups. Okay. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. If you've got a whole school approach, your PD is easier, your staff PD. So if you decide, see, remember in a whole school approach, one of the schools, Our Lady of the Angels, they decided to do a CST theme per term for the whole school, so that their PD was on stewardship in term 1. Their PD was on, common good in term 2. Right? Its weakness is how you differentiate across year levels, right? But it does solve your PD problem, right? And it does assist you in getting all teachers, on the same page related to that. What other strengths and weaknesses do you see with it? Mm-hmm. Yep. Don't force it. That's right. Yeah. So that's the other thing. If it doesn't fit, don't do it. Right? It's where it most powerfully fits. Right? Go back to my statement about you don't start counting angels instead of ducks. Right? If you've got to do that, you're forcing it. Right? But if you have an open conversation with your staff, right, they might say, well, for stewardship, this would fit my geography part, or this would fit in my science part, but it's not going to fit anywhere else. That's fine. Right? So, yeah, it has to be explicit and it has to be real. Yeah.
The strength of that first approach as a place to start is that you have a common language.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. And see, the other thing too is there are many approaches to Catholic perspectives. What's going to be an identifiable one to start with? Right? If you start talking about a sacramental view of the world, you might be leaving a lot of people on another plane. Right? This is what Ontario decided. If they started with Catholic social teaching, at least there were some concrete things and examples to deal with. Right? And then they could move to some bigger questions. Yes?
effectively for us about where Catholic social teach, get into those NJR core concepts. And that could be another way of
Sure.
pulling them together in an authentic way.
And it's got to be authentic. That's the thing. Yeah.
A lot of the NJR stuff feels on human dignity.
Yes. Yeah.
How do we treat people? Because so that would be really easy for me to start with.
The other thing related to Catholic social teaching is that there are models of social analysis to unpack it. So that's what I've just put in the handout on your table, on your chair. So the CJAR-JACT model is a 3-step model, which has some breakdown questions on page 2. The pastoral spiral model develops out of the writing of Joe Holland and Peter Henriot, and it's an expansion of the CJAR-JACT model. And it works across a variety of disciplines, right? So you need to find, it's not just about talking about religion, but it's about what has influenced these situations and how might they be brought to the fore. And then the model can also be used with younger kids. I think I've got it here. Yeah. So it can be that model, oh, how, so, go, or it can be awareness of the experience, exploration and analysis, reflection, action and response, right? So it's how you approach the model with kids that is significant. So there's a plain sheet of paper on your chair. So one last thing I'd like you to do. So this time I do need you in a group of 4 and you need a pen with your plain sheet of paper. If you could just get into your groups of 4 first before chaos reigns. Okay, you're in a group of 4. Here's your task. Right, this is called a yes and. Okay, so the question that's being posed is, how might Catholic perspectives be made more explicit across the curriculum? Right, so your sentence will begin with, Catholic perspectives can be made more explicit across the curriculum. And you're going to finish that sentence. Each person is going to write that sentence in the first time. Right, so just hang on till I give you all the directions. Right, and then after a minute, I will say rotate, and you are going to give your sentence to the person on your right. So you're going to give them the piece of paper. Right, it'll be the person on your right. And the second person will write yes and they're going to add something to it. There are no buts. All right, so let me give you an example. We're going to cement the whole of the playground. Yes, and then we could put high-set vegetable gardens around the edge. All right, so it's not, we're going to cement the whole of the playground. No, but you can't do that because they'll all skin their knees. Okay, so it's a yes and. All right, so your question is, how might Catholic perspectives be made more explicit across the curriculum? Catholic perspectives can be made more explicit across the curriculum. You finish the sentence now. Time's up. You're going to rotate to your right. Give the person your right. And you will respond with yes and you're going to write something else. Ready to rotate to your right? No, okay. You're only supposed to have a minute, you know. Okay, rotate. Yes, and. This should be person 3. Final rotate. Yes, and. Okay, we done? No. I've asked a couple of groups to read theirs out just to get you started. Oh, yes. Can I go to this group here? Yep. You're nearly done? Okay. 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 Do you want to start? Yeah.
Catholic perspectives can be made more explicit across the curriculum by being part of the initial planning process by teachers, yes, and deciding on school-wide themes and plans, yes, and focus PD on that theme teacher plan, and yes, that's embedded across the school.
Thank you. This group?
Yes.
Yep, off you go.
Catholic perspectives can be made more explicit across the curriculum by breaking open one principle of CST across the whole curriculum each year, and by using the injection model, it will be essential to check how effectively this works with knowledge, skill, understanding and wisdom, and engaging in meaningful dialogue about it.
Thank you. Someone else on this side of the room? Their group? Anyone? Thank you. Thank you. So one of the challenges put out to us by the Congregation for Catholic Education is, what are we doing about the general curriculum? The general curriculum is not values neutral. So what is it that we bring from a Catholic perspective to the general curriculum, and how do we make that explicit in the teaching for all teachers and for all students? And in our research around this space, what we found was, when we surveyed Queensland teachers, and some of you would have filled this out, is that your generation of teachers are quite aware of it. Teachers who are early career teachers are not aware of a Catholic perspective much at all, and don't really know what to do about it, that it is a generational thing. Right? And so if we're going to have sustainability of Catholic education into the future, we've got to start to make this more explicit and how we do that. I'm happy, as I said before, to send you the PowerPoint. So my email address is up there and I will send it to Diane and she'll have it. But if anyone wants it by this afternoon, just pop me an email and I'll send it through to you. Thanks, everyone.